A very warm welcome to this SNS webinar, where we will focus on the growth of protectionism in the world and also on the impact of policy changes and trade barriers on the digital economy. It's a great honor to welcome Professor Simon Evenett from the University of St. Gallen, and also being the coordinator of Global Trade Alert and Digital Policy Alert that we will learn more about today. And later on in the panel discussions, we will be joined by Per-Arne Hjelmborn, Director General for Trade at the Ministry for Foreign Affairs, Joakim Reiter, Vodafone Group, and Pehrsson, Ericsson. And I will present them when it's time for them to come into the discussion. My name is Mia of Rantzien, and I am the CEO of SNS. So let me welcome Simon Evenett into the screen. You are currently Professor of International Trade and Economic Development at the University of St. Gallen. You have taught at a number of different universities in the US and in Europe. And you have served twice as an official at the World Bank. And you've been non-resident senior fellow in the Economic Studies program of the Brookings Institution, and also a member of the UK Competition Commission. So you have a very wide range of background on the issues that we're going to talk about today and also get a discussion on. So we're very happy to welcome you here at SNS. Before we start, as always at SNS, we want the audience to take part in the discussion. And the way you do it is by using the Q&A function on the bottom of your screen. And we will take them up whenever they come in, and also in the panel discussion, of course. So let's start. Simon, the screen is yours.
Thank you, Mia, for this opportunity to be able to present the work of the Global Trade Alert and the Digital Policy Alert to a Swedish audience. As you said, the theme of today's discussion is of rising protectionism, and I have a few slides which I'd like to share with you. So I'll get stuck straight into that. Hopefully you can see my slides up on the screen now in front of you. Essentially what I'm going to do here is to summarize why transparency is a desirable quality that we need in the global trading system, why we haven't got it, and then show you the results of our efforts to try and add to the transparency of the trading system, drawing out in particular the implications for Sweden. Now, I take it as a sort of starting point that we accept that access to foreign markets is a pillar of Swedish prosperity. It's also a pillar of many other countries' prosperity. And access to those markets is contingent on transparent government policy for two reasons. The quotes I have on the slide here highlight the two reasons. First, transparency discourages subtly bad behavior by governments. Doesn't ensure the absence of bad behavior, but it certainly discourages it. And secondly, as we try and find ways to open up markets over time, we need high quality information about what governments are up to. And this is true of older areas of international trade, such as agriculture, and very new areas of global commerce, such as digital trade. And so for both of these reasons, we need high levels of transparency in order to sustain access to foreign markets, to build on that, and to deliver prosperity. Unfortunately, we don't have that level of transparency for a number of reasons. We have governments not complying with notification requirements at the World Trade Organization. We have the biggest economies in the world systematically starving the WTO Secretariat of Information, especially on their general economic support measures or subsidies. We have no sustained monitoring of non-tariff barriers and no comprehensive coverage of subsidies either. So all of these whole gaps are in the monitoring and the transparency processes that are in the current world trading system, and they are by design, and they will not go away unless action is taken. And 12 years ago, my colleagues and I decided that we were going to take action in this area, and that we would start gathering, creating, and analyzing policy interventions, or other gathering information about policy interventions, analyzing them, and creating policy intelligence through sustained monitoring of government policy actions. And so over time, we have fused trade policy talent and coding expertise so as to to build two monitoring initiatives, the Global Trade Alert and the Digital Policy Alert, and I will share information on both of them with you. We are also planning a third pillar of our activities, which is to monitor the government policies that facilitate a move towards the low carbon economy, but might also have cross-border implications. So these three pillars represent the three areas of activity of the St. Gallen Endowment for Prosperity Through Trade, which is the independent Swiss foundation that we created to advance our policy surveillance work. Now, we have been operating since November 2008, and you can see over time here the number of policy interventions that we have published information on. And you can see that in the last 5 years, our tracking of the world economy has quadrupled. And this really represents the investments that we have made in trade policy talent, as well as in tracking systematically what governments have been doing. At the moment, 38 people work for the St. Gallen Endowment. And as we have made these investments, so our coverage has improved and our ability to be able to deliver high quality policy intelligence has increased correspondingly. Let me show you some of the fruits of this particular work. Let's start with traditional policy interventions with respect to trade, such as tariffs, border measures, and behind the border measures, such as subsidies and the like. And what I've done here is to draw out the implications for Sweden's commercial interests. So the first chart I have for you is to show you how the share of exports, Swedish goods exports, facing trade reforms and trade distortions in foreign markets has changed over time. Our monitoring begins in November 2008, so that's why everything starts at zero there. And you can see as we go into the global financial crisis, there's a huge jump in the share of Swedish exports that face trade distortions, and this reflects a scaling up of export incentives by some large emerging markets, as well as a whole series of defensive actions taken during the start of the global financial crisis. Then over time, we've seen a progressive increase in the share of Swedish exports facing trade distortions abroad. The small dip in 2021 really just reflects the lags we have in being able to track subsidies, and I'll be fairly sure that this percentage will continue to rise. Unfortunately, the share of Swedish exports facing trade distortions is about 3.5 times the size of Swedish exports facing trade reforms. And the green line here, you can see, lies well below the red line. These calculations here are done with the finest grained trade data available, and they take account of when policies are introduced and when they lapse. So there is no reason why these percentages have to rise over time. The conclusion then is that the increases over time in the shares of goods exports facing trade distortions abroad is a function of essentially accumulation of discriminatory policies undertaken abroad, and this has unfortunately added up to reduced market access for Swedish goods exporters. One could go further and look how often different types of Swedish exports have been hit by foreign trade distortions. So instead of seeing how much trade has been, how much trade is exposed to trade distortions, we can also see how many times they've been hit. And it's the case that at the moment, about 1/3 of Swedish goods exports face 6 or more trade distortions in foreign markets. So this gives you a sense of the deterioration over time in the trading environment faced by Swedish firms. And I should add, by the way, similar patterns can be found for other highly competitive economies which are engaging in the global economy. They too face this problem. So this is a common problem that we have seen. Our work also enables us to track over time developments in trade policies abroad, and we can therefore figure out in any one year where the new trade policy problems are being created and where new opportunities are being created as well. And we can see here on this particular chart that the threats to Swedish goods exports this year are about 6 times the size of the market opportunities that we found abroad due to countries either withdrawing trade barriers or lowering them as part of a unilateral liberalization efforts. So this year we can see that the balance is tilted very much in the wrong direction. But the key thing about this type of information is that it can be used by firms and by trade ministries to identify where the real problems are. And with that in mind, I took the actions which have been taken this year, which harm Swedish exports, and broke them down by the countries that are most responsible. And it turns out the threats to Swedish goods exports this year, for example, are concentrated in a small number of countries. We have 7 countries where more than $1 billion of Swedish goods exports have been threatened by trade policy actions taken this year. You can see several of these trading partners are in the European Union. And so we are not talking here about classic border measures. These are normally subsidies which have been awarded to firms which compete against Swedish firms exporting them to those countries. We can see, of course, there are countries outside of the European Union as well who have also put in place trade distortions this year, which worsen the commercial prospects of Swedish goods exporters. The USA, UK, and China are cases in point. So the data that we have collected can be used to generate these types of aggregate data, but we can also drill down by sector and by product down to the 6-digit HS code. So we can actually track systematically what's going on at that level too. So for many companies, and there are some industry groups and companies that we have worked with, they of course have very targeted interests. And so the sectors and the products that they want to track are much more targeted, and our database can provide that type of information as well. So if we step back and address the policy question though, what I have been showing you in these last few slides is that in the traditional goods trade area, we have seen a substantial pickup over time in trade distortions abroad, and these implicate large shares of Swedish goods exports. And as we've seen, this tendency towards greater protectionism is unfolding even this year, and it's possible to identify which countries are responsible for it. So this is the type of policy intelligence that we can extract from the global trade alert. What I would like to do now is to turn to the digital policy alert. I should also add, before I just go into this particular segment of the presentation, that we also track information on changes in foreign direct investment policy, as well as changes in policies affecting the service sector as well, more generally. And these are available on our website. And the type of work that we do collecting this type of policy intelligence is then analyzed. And you can see in the background to my presentation here, a reference to our latest report, where we've put together a treasure trove of information on the subsidies of the European Union, China, and the United States. And so we produce reports as well, which you can download off our website. So that's the global trade alert work. Let me now turn to the digital digital policy alert. This was motivated by the very serious concern that the digital economy is fragmenting, and that this compromises the business models of many companies which are seeking to be very successful in this sector. It also discourages innovation, and this of course sets back human progress along lots of different dimensions. And of course that human progress is not just measured in terms of commercial opportunities, the ability to transform lives in medicine and also telecommunications and the like. There are many ways in which the digital economy delivers for societies, and fragmentation of that digital space is a retrograde move. Well, so our second pillar then seeks to collect information on the changes in policies affecting the digital economy. We started this work in April of this year, and we've already documented over 1,500 policy changes since the beginning of last year. We have created a tracker of policy changes in 9 areas of law for the G20 countries, the European Union, and Switzerland. And this tracker is what we call the Digital Policy Alert, and it is what's available on our website. We are starting now to do detailed mapping of policies, structured comparisons of policy interventions over time. And this is an area which is we're developing, and we want to be able to take a stand on whether or not policy has fallen short of global standards, and whether or not it's discriminatory and discouraging overseas companies. So this is ultimately the goal. Let me show you what we have been able to find up until now. Just to be clear on the scope, the 9 areas of policy are listed here. We have looked at all levels of government, subnational, national, supranational, and our policy tracker also tracks the progress of legislation as well. Let me summarize what we found. On the right-hand side is a map which I clipped this morning showing the frequency of interventions in the digital policy, in these digital policy domains. And the darker the country, the more active they have been. We can see that Europe and the United States are very active domains, so is China as well. On the left-hand side here, you can see that for the 700 or so policy changes that we've seen, or regulatory changes that we've seen this year, you can see the EU and the USA are very heavily represented with, in the case of the EU, a large number of member state activity, and also in the United States, a large number of state as well as federal actions. The UK and China have formed too. They are being very active. And so we are beginning to build a picture of what governments are doing in this respect. Now, of course, this just gives you counts at the aggregate level for countries. One can go further and break down the information according to different areas of policy, and you can see where the action is more intense. In the area of data governance, we see a huge amount of activity this year, and mainly in data protection regulation. Here, of course, the EU policy, the EU regime is being copied in part around the world. We also see an expansion in the number of cybersecurity regulations as well. In competition, lots and lots of unilateral conduct investigations against the large players, but these are not the only areas which where we see action. One of the things we found in the Global Trade Alert is that some of the most important interventions fly below the radar screen of journalists and are not so salient. And we can see lots of action in the area of content and operating conditions as well. Taxation developments, of course, have received attention in the news, and we have managed to pick those up as well. So our second pillar is building out this, developing this type of in-depth policy monitoring and intelligence that we have done in the Global Trade Alert, but for the digital economy. And this is an area of ongoing work, and we are continuing to, we will be making further investments in this area as well. Let me just wrap up by saying, if you want to learn more or you want to engage with us, we would very much welcome that. You can go to our website, which is publicly available. Everything on it is free. You can subscribe to our policy intelligence alerts on both the Global Trade Alert and the Digital Policy Alert. There is a policy analysis, like the report which is in the background to my screen here. These can be made available too. And if you want to know more about our endowment and our guiding vision for that, then that's available too, but in German. I'm sure, I know Swedish people can read German often, so that's not hard to track as well. So that hopefully lays out what we have been doing, if we step back and we think about the policy implications here, we are moving we have been in a world of moving towards policy, greater protectionism over the last 12 years in the traditional sense, and I'm afraid we're at the verge of moving towards a much more fragmented digital policy economy. Neither of these things are good for Swedish prosperity or for anybody else's prosperity for that matter. And I think what we need to be doing is thinking of creative ways to build coalitions to prevent these outcomes and to turn them around. Thank you very much for your time and attention.
Thank you very much, Simon, for this overview, which is packed with facts and details. And we got this summary from you. I was wondering, I mean, how has your intelligence been received? I mean, how big is the interest from governments or from industry or other actors?
So over time, the range of users of our policy intelligence has grown considerably. So at first, of course, there was, I think, quite a lot of resistance from some of the more official sources to our work. But I think over time, as people have seen that we have sustained at it, we've kept at it, we have stuck to a particular methodology and approach, which we're very open to. People have got used to our work. So the user community amongst governments is extremely extensive. and not every government, of course, likes what we find. But I can assure you, given what we can see on our website traffic, that all the big players are regularly coming and looking at our findings as well. Our reports have received a lot of attention. Interestingly, this report we have done on subsidies is one which you'd think would make some governments nervous, but after a meeting with Chinese officials, they have actually translated verbatim our executive summary and published it on the MOFCOM site with almost an encouragement for people to read it. So I think there's a sense out there that we need to have an even-handed third party that provides this type of information. With respect to companies, we've worked with individual companies, we've worked with business associations as well. We have a great relationship with the International Chamber of Commerce and with some national business associations as well, and pan-European ones. So I think that's worked well. The other very important user community for our work are journalists, who are often very pressed. They need to be able to present evidence and up-to-date facts against deadlines, and we work extensively with them to make sure that they get the right information as well. So, and I should add, of course, the last user group of our work is our analysts and professors who write research papers based on our work, and now over 2,600 papers have been written which cite our work. So this is generating a body of findings which trade policymakers and corporate executives can use in their advocacy.
Just one clarification, you mentioned MOFCOM, and for those who don't know, that's the Chinese Foreign Trade Ministry. And you were, as you told me before the meeting we discussed it, you said you had quite a lengthy meeting with them explaining your work, which is quite interesting.
They ask very, very careful and extensive questions, but my sense from them is they appreciate our even-handedness.
Could you dwell a little bit on that? I mean, why is this a private initiative? Why is it not so that WTO or some other international organization do this work? In whose interest is this not to be done?
I mean, it's a very good question. I think there are some governments which are extremely sensitive about international organizations collecting this information and publishing it. And for those of us who've been in and around Geneva, we know which governments we're talking about. There are a number of countries which do not want the Secretariat to collect information. They only want the Secretariat to take information which is fed to it by governments. So that's one area. A second area is that once you get into the analysis of this type of information, this can be very, very controversial. And the OECD's relations with a number of emerging markets are pretty sour based on the fact that the OECD has tried to do high quality analysis. And so it's very hard for international organizations to be able to operate in this relatively contentious space. So I think we need to have, we need this work to be done. It needs to be done in an independent, professional, neutral way. And so we took the view that creating a foundation was the right vehicle to do that, and to be based in a neutral country, I think also adds.
So thank you. Please I want to remind you in the audience that feel free to send in questions and we take them up. But I think we continue now. So I would like to invite our panelists to the screen. And I will present you each one of you and also ask you a first question. So let me start with Per-Arne Hjelmborn. Since September 2019, you are the Director General for Trade at the Ministry for Foreign Affairs in Sweden. And before taking that position, you were the Swedish ambassador to Brazil, and also before that, the ambassador to Malaysia. And you have also been the head of the Department for the EU Internal Market and the promotion of Sweden and Swedish trade at the Ministry for Foreign Affairs. So maybe Per-Arne, we can do like this. As we hear you,
Yeah.
I think I can put you the question, and then we see if you get the help. We get you into the picture whenever that happens. But I think you can talk to us without the picture. So, given what we have just heard and what Simon just described, can you give a short summary of the Swedish government's position on the developments that were described? And as we are in a period now, next week we will have the WTO ministerial. It would be very interesting also to get some insight into the preparations of the EU positions ahead of the upcoming ministerial in a few days. Per-Arne, we hear you, so please.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone, and thank you, Mia, for having me and for hosting this meeting, and of course of choosing such an important and relevant theme. I have no meeting alert comes up and I click the button, but still I continue like this. Also, of course, thank you to you, Simon, for your very important work and your interesting presentation. And I could not agree more with you on the importance of transparency, and that mapping trade barriers is crucial for us, but also a somewhat resource-consuming work. I know that by the fact that we are, our embassies are every year tasked to compile a trade barriers report, which we make full use of course. And we use them also to report in the notification mechanism, both internally in the EU, of course, but also at the WTO level. And we are also, I'm proud to say, one of the largest funders to various institutions to enhance the capacities in support of the rules-based trading system. But now to the question at hand, and what is the Swedish government position and what are we doing? Well, first the basic, I think that it's important to state that Sweden is a country characterized by a very high degree of trade intensity. For a country of our size, we also have a great number of multinational companies, and many of them, I'm proud to say, are at the forefront of digitalization. And so needless to say, for the Swedish government, digitalization is a priority where we strive to be in the forefront to utilize opportunities. And secondly, when we look at the issue of digitalization and trade policy at large, we must reconcile that for companies and all other economic actors today, there's hardly any divide between the digital and the physical product. And just to give you an example, I mean, we have, as you know, two big truck manufacturers, Volvo and Scania. What do they actually produce? Well, they produce a computer on wheels with a highly sophisticated digital services package included. That's what they produce. Given the importance of the digitalization, cross-border data flows is crucial for us, and we need to make sure that the rules regarding these data flows work as smooth as possible. And thirdly, there are many arenas and issues where we as a government can and should act to build this digital environment that is conducive to trade. And let me touch upon a few of them. We have global issues and they need, of course, global solutions. And Mia, you mentioned the WTO. I'm traveling on Sunday to Geneva for the next ministerial conference, the MC12. I used to participate in these ones, I think, together with Joakim at some 15 years ago. But now it's different times, and we know that it's going to be a tricky affair to get any good results or even meaningful results this time. But I can assure you that Sweden we will be working very hard for an ambitious approach for the EU ahead of this meeting. And one of the areas which we focus a lot on is on the plurilateral negotiations on e-commerce within the WTO, where we have now more than close to 90 countries participating, including China and the US, covering 90% of the world trade. And there's an area where EU can and should lead by example to show flexibility, but also ambition. And so that's on WTO. Internally also, we need to constantly push the EU agenda, and strengthening the digital single market is key for us. And in order to do that, Sweden has taken the initiative to work together with the like-minded countries in this area. We created what we call the D9 group, the digital frontrunners of sort of the most ambitious 9 member states in the EU. In fact, we're actually D+ now. Some have joined us now. And the idea is to reach common understandings on different policy proposals, and also to try to influence the agenda as soon as possible. And for the digital market to unlock its full potential, we need to ensure that there are no delays in the rollout of 5G technology. I think both Ulf and Joakim will comment on that. And at the same time, this is 5G, but we need to look ahead already now and make sure that we can have a framework that ensures that the 6G and what comes beyond will also guarantee secure but also trusted networks that can benefit both citizens and all our businesses. And this is best achieved, I think, by promoting global and transparent standards and establishing a technology-neutral regulatory framework where the market will choose the technology of the future based on their merits, which is important for us. And we also need strong partnership with key markets. That's a key fundamental for us. And for Sweden, it's vital that the EU trade policy promotes openness, but also a rules-based trade to engage with the stakeholders in development of European and international standards. So economies and companies and researchers around the globe are intertwined. We know that they're dependent on one another, and our businesses are really dependent on the global value chains. You know that only 30% of the international trade is with finished product, and while the 70% is raw materials, parts, components, services for business and capital goods. So, as a tech economy, which we consider ourselves to be, highly innovative and also a vocal supporter of a positive transatlantic trade relationship, Sweden has particularly welcomed the establishment of the EU-US Trade and Technology Council, which held its last meeting, or first meeting, I would say, in September. And we think there's a real need for a forum to address these key global trade, economic, and technology issues, which with our transatlantic partners. Also, of course, we share the democratic values, which I think is important in this context. And we know that for a fact that neither the EU nor the US can shape and regulate new emerging technologies in isolation. We will need to work together. So we think it was an important first step, and we look forward now for the 10 working groups to sort of make progress for the next meeting, hopefully in the spring of next year. And finally, just to sum up, coming back to your work, Simon, and your presentation, I think with the ambitions that we have for trade agreements and new initiatives, we must always make sure that we implement and enforce what we have agreed upon. That's something that we constantly raise in the EU context, but also in all other sort of FTA, free trade agreements, and in the plurilaterals and the WTO context. And therefore, Simon, your watchdog and the Global Trade Alert is really a good contribution in this respect. So lots of initiatives and particular issues could be discussed, but I think we can take quick questions and answers as we go. I'll stop there. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Per-Arne, for that overview. As you said, I think we go directly now and invite Ulf Pehrsson to come in to the discussion. You are Vice President, Government and Industry Relations at Ericsson. And prior to joining Ericsson, you served as the Deputy Director General at the Swedish Ministry for Foreign Affairs, and also as Director at the Ministry for Industry and Trade. And you also have represented Sweden, the Swedish government, in a number of different embassies around the world. So you have a wide background. And I would like to ask you, from your perspective, where you are today, which are the main drivers behind the development that Simon described in his presentation? And how will it affect your industry, consumers, and the world at large?
Thank you, Mia, and thanks for inviting me to this event focusing on very important issues. And I should start out by saying also congratulate Simon and the work you are doing here, and also now focusing on the digital trade barriers, which are growing, as you can see. Just to understand where we come from in Ericsson, I mean, we are a true global company. We're doing business in 180 markets around the world. We have less than 1% of our sales in Sweden, obviously, and we are then very much focusing on and dependent on open global markets, and therefore also we're very much focusing on the multilateral trade system, WTO. And before, I mean, focusing on protectionism, what drives that, I think we need to see where we're coming from, because as strange as it may sound today, I mean, we've seen actually a wave of trade liberalization when it comes to digital products. I mean, right after the end of the last global round that succeeded, the Uruguay round, work started on freeing up trade in IT and telecom products around the world in the ITA agreement. And now, 25 years later, we see that half of the WTO members are there. Doesn't sound too good, but more than 90% of trade in IT and telecom products are actually duty-free on what's called most favored nation basis. So that's a very strong platform, of course. And we have seen, of course, how this liberalization combined with global standards, open standards that Per-Arne talked about, has actually taken us I mean, brought tremendous benefits to the world. But then, of course, at the same time, we've seen growing protectionism and the drivers for that. Of course, traditionally, and in some markets, there has been a drive for localization when it comes to production, software development, even intellectual property, etc. So that has been one of the drivers. That's sort of, let's call it sort of traditional protectionism, including, of course, subsidies that we see in some markets. But I think also that Simon referred to the data protection issue, because we see, of course, with the success and the global spread of sort of IT and telecom, data is so much in focus. It's sort of the bloodstream of the economic system. It's not so much more the physical products and services itself. It's actually data. And there we see, of course, that Europe setting sort of a global sort of model here with the GDPR, which in itself, I mean, is remarkable, and we should congratulate us on that. But at the same time, we have to remember that GDPR is actually prohibiting sending data outside of the European Union. So I mean, there is a sort of a built-in sort of trade restrictive aspect of data protection, and of course that is being handled through so-called adequacy agreements, but they're unilateral. We saw that in the EU-Japan free trade agreement, it was not possible to integrate data flows, etc. So what we heard from Per-Arne as well, I mean, cross-border data flows is critical, and so on the one hand, yes, of course, we need to protect data privacy for individuals, but at the same time, we need to make sure that the data transfers are absolutely needed for companies, like you say, like truck manufacturers or whatever sector is actually critical. Other drivers, of course, is what I call sort of the flag factor, so to speak. I mean, I think traditionally, yes, we have had protectionism. Look and say we really need to have the products and the systems sort of manufactured or protected here at home. But increasingly, we see that it's not only what is required is that the products or the services delivered are delivered from the home base, but actually what is the flag of the provider here. So we see that in Europe, where in the data field there are strong demands, and then also looking for subsidies to create sort of a European cloud provider, for example, where American players are leading. And we see in our space, where Ericsson is a world leader in mobile infrastructure, that the fact in the US that they have no national provider is a call for American players. So I think And we see similar tendencies, let's say in India, especially, I mean, in the large economies, of course, and even Japan, saying we need to have national players here. So I think this is it's a clear tendency here, and that can also move into an area which Per-Arne highlighted, namely that governments are moving away from the agreed model in the WTO and the technical barriers to trade agreement. I mean, that what constitutes a global standard, and also that governments are also looking to fragment the global standardization system that has served us so well. So there are a number of challenges out there, and governments even mandating technology, but still with the sort of the flag issue there. So I think that you say, what will the consequences be? Well, we will have less. I mean, I think Simon put it very well. I mean, the digital economy and open digital trade and open markets, it's not a sector issue. It's not as if, okay, we have barriers in the vehicle industry or in the chemicals industry or something like that. This is an innovation platform for our whole societies. So whatever is being introduced as barriers to the open flow of products and data here actually negatively impacts the whole innovation climate around the world, driving less productivity, etc. So of course it will be negative for consumers as well as for enterprises. So and that's of course coming back to Simon's presentation, the fact that you are now focusing on trade barriers in the digital economy is absolutely critical, because that we are, all sectors and all parts of our societies are dependent on that. Otherwise, that's of course why it's so serious that we see these increasing barriers.
Thank you, Ulf. I turn directly to Joakim Reiter at Vodafone, and welcome you into the discussion. You are Chief External and Corporate Affairs Officers and also Executive Committee member. And before joining Vodafone in 2017, you were the Assistant Secretary General of the United Nations and the Deputy Secretary General of United Nations Conference on Trade and Development, UNCTAD, based in Geneva. And also before that, you were you've served 15 years in the Foreign Service, and including being Deputy Director General at the Ministry for Foreign Affairs, and Ambassador to the World Trade Organization, and also permanent and the permanent representation to the European Union. So it's a very wide background also, as the other speakers also have. So I want to ask you the same questions that I asked Ulf. From your perspective, what are the main drivers behind the developments we see, and how would that affect your industry, consumers, and the world at large? Please, Joakim.
Thank you very much. Thanks a lot, and thanks for having me. I really appreciate it. And just to say, Ulf and I are sort of in the same industry, but at the same time not, because he's actually much more global than I am, if we're being honest. Telecom is, if you take away the equipment, the company that I represent is the world's most globalized telecom service provider. Doesn't mean that we're largest, just means that we have the greatest footprint. 1/5 of all internet traffic around the globe runs on Vodafone networks. We have the largest IoT platform outside China. And we are predominantly present in Europe and Africa and India and a little bit in the Pacific. But we are sort of the Hotel California of companies, which means that we can check out, but we can never leave. So we are locally licensed. We're completely under the control of every government in every country we operate in. And that makes a huge difference compared to if you're, say, a manufacturer, you create equipment or you build a truck, you sell it or you don't sell it. You have a factory that you can write off within 7 years if it turns sour. We can never exit a market. And that means that we're particularly sensitive and vulnerable to protectionist tendencies. So Simon's fantastic work But I also want to say that Per-Arne referred to D9, which I think is an absolutely essential lever for Sweden and Swedish interest in the EU. This is what we're discussing about now is almost an existential battle that is going on, that has been going on for quite some time in terms of the drivers, but certainly accelerated significantly during COVID. So the three drivers I want to highlight, and I'm sort of taking it more at the macro level because Ulf has covered how it affects also companies like us on more specific items. I think first one that we need to recognize is the fundamental shift in the understanding of geopolitics. And that has a direct effect that the firewalls, the compartmentalization that trade policymakers have afforded themselves in the past no longer works. You have now a complete bleed over between security, technology, and trade policy. You no longer can run your trade policy separate from your security posture and your technology vision. And that fundamentally changes things. So that's why you're having what Rolf referred to, the question around flag. The country of origin as a political imperative for driving how you determine whether someone should act in your market is actually a reflection of the fact that governments haven't figured out how to navigate security in the cyberspace, how to navigate security on data. So it automatically leads them to the quick fix of country of origin, which of course is completely pointless. It will not lead to any security, but it is an understandable, legitimate concern that they need to change their security posture. It also is that we have a fundamental conversation right now going on whether we decouple, which by the way is the prevalent US view, or whether we coexist with China. And that is still ongoing in terms of technical standards, in terms of use of technology, in terms of joint innovation. Do we have a decoupling scenario or do we have a coexisting scenario? No one is arguing anymore for integration of global markets and technology. No one is standing on the barricades except for industry participants, but in governments, we really don't see it. Second big driver is what I call as good conscience protectionism. In other words, the reality is that over the last couple of years, the political impunity of particularly US tech is over. They have had a free reign, and that has led the virtual economy to run on different rules than the real economy. And obviously policymakers want to address that. That was an unsustainable situation to be in. That's completely logical. The problem is that when they now impose restrictions and regulations, they throw out basic principles that we have in WTO around what is legitimate objectives, what is necessary and proportionate to achieve your legitimate objectives. And the pendulum is swinging far too much in a radical direction. In that is that we have fully embraced value-based foreign economic policy, which poses significant problems to the corporate world, as well as increasingly in the EU, the wish to be extraterritorial, which Ulf referred to in the GDPR, where we're saying we set standards, we impose it on the world. That is a very dangerous development to go down. The third thing that we are dealing with is a revival of industrial policy. The view of the balance between market and politics has changed. Obviously, the COVID led many governments, including the Swedish one, to become the salary payer of last resort. That's basically what a furlough scheme is. That changes the definition of the role of the state and automatically, therefore, changes the role of the state in also international trade. So that's why you see all the arguments around resilience. Do we need to relocate production chains? That's why you have strategic autonomy coming back. That's why you have IPCEI to address the fact that Europe is lagging behind in a number of technologies. And that's a real battleground on when you revive industrial policy. Do you go back to the 70s or do you define a new industrial policy that is smart, progressive, and still open? And that's being battled out in the EU as we speak. Now, just to give you a sense, to confirm what Simon is saying in terms of European protectionism, we run ESG, Ulf does as well for Ericsson, but I'm in charge of sustainability in Vodafone. So I was called to the board to explain how come a subsidiary in Africa, Vodacom, is ranked number 1 on ESG in the world, and Vodafone Group is ranked number 12. So I went and had to look at all the factors. Every single factor, we were better than Vodacom. Every single one, except one. And the one that we were beaten by at Vodacom was the sense of capital markets that Europe is so protectionist that you can't make money anymore. The innovation by permission approach by the European Union stifles the profitability of the digital and telecom industry to the point that actually capital markets in its assessment of ESG of European companies say that Africa is easier to do business in than Europe today. there needs to be a reality check in the discussions around this. And that's a capital market judgment. It's nothing I can do about it, but they basically compile up all the regulatory trends and ask themselves, what do we think this will imply for companies in Europe in the future, to the point that political risk in Africa is now weighted less by capital markets than regulatory risk in Europe.
Thank you very much. I think it will be very interesting to hear comments from Simon on what you have listened to. And also, you know, the questions around the geopolitics and how the impact of that on the trends that you have shown. What is your view on that?
So Mia, let me start with your last point on the EU, on the changing direction of EU policy. To be frank, I'm really quite worried about the direction the EU is going in. And I fear things will get worse with the new German government as well. I think we are going to move into a phase where Europe will become much more openly critical of China. I think Mrs. Merkel probably held the line on that, and that's over. I don't know to what degree the US and the EU will align on the China bashing side of this, but I think the relations between the EU and China are about to get a lot worse. I think, to pick up on what has been said about industrial policy, I too see exactly the same trends, which is the EU seems to take the view that throwing money at problems is the way to solve problems. And I think anyone who's watched business or seen people build businesses, they realize there's a lot of things that have got to come together. A lot of it, you know, internal capabilities, resources, and the like. And you can't just solve problems by you know, creating a vehicle like the European Investment Bank and flooding different sectors with lots of cash. So I think the European approach is a little bit misguided, quite frankly. I think they have a tool, which is money, and and the question is, what problems can we solve with it, rather than going back to the fundamentals and asking, how do we improve the business environment across Europe in ways which will help not only make the current firms more competitive, but actually encourage the next great wave of entrepreneurs to come through with ideas. So I think I see that going very much, and unfortunately, in the wrong direction. I could only endorse the points that also Joakim made about the three drivers. We see the three drivers of protectionism being exactly the ones which he has mentioned, and it is creating, I think, a very difficult environment to work in. And if you think about just going forward, take the challenge of moving to a low carbon economy. How governments have stated that they do not have the money to be able to make these trillions of dollars of investments, and people have estimated that we are talking about possibly 100 trillion in investments over the next couple of decades. Well, if the private sector is going to do that, then they will need some type of assurances on public policy, on the stability of public policy, transparency of public policy, and I don't think they're getting that. I think what we'll end up with is governments trying to throw a lot of money at these problems, which will create a potential subsidy races, and these subsidy races and then will create trade frictions as well. We're already seeing in the data tit for tat dynamics on subsidies and trade distortions arising from subsidies. So I fear that this will get worse, and I think we are at a very critical juncture where we need to spend the next few years mapping out where can we develop some good guidelines so that the important issues like dealing with climate change and alike, and building an appropriate digital economy, these things do not spill over and create the next wave of trade tensions. And I think we can do it, but I think we need to get enough people to that point and start working through these issues ourselves.
Could I ask you, is there a lack of awareness when it comes to, policymakers proposing policies that they don't, fully understand will also have cross-border effects? Or is it, a purpose behind, but you just keep quiet about it in order to also, for some reason that you want that effect? I mean, of course, it probably differs between different types of policies, but how much information is necessary? How much more coherence is necessary within governments in order to get a clear picture of the trade effects?
Well, let's start with your last point. We need much more coherence. We need governments to start seeing that the major policy changes that they're taking will have knock-on effects across borders and with trading partners and the like. Then let's come to your earlier point. There are both, I think, sins of commission and omission that are happening. I must say, in dealing with trade ministries around the world, you often find these are often ministries which are incredibly stretched. I mean, the governments have not made the levels of human capital investments necessary, I think, in many countries. So you get ministries which are overstretched, and they don't have either the time or the resources necessarily to be able to acquire this type of policy intelligence and digest it. And I think that's a real tragedy. I think within Europe, we have another dynamic, which is that many member states, not all, many member states essentially have outsourced all thinking about trade policy to Brussels, and that's not necessarily such a good idea. We're talking to a Swedish audience here. I do not count Sweden in that list of countries, but I do think we have a problem there as well.
Ulf, please.
Yes, I heard the word decoupling, and that of course is something that we see when it comes to supply chains, for example. But I think what is really and fundamentally important, as we say, as we in Ericsson coming from an industry where the whole world has benefited from working from what we see now as one global standard for mobile communications. It's a cooperative effort across regions where sort of European, North American, Asian, including Chinese innovators are building a global standard. And I think it would be extremely dangerous, and also referring to what Per-Arne said about the next generation. There is also next generation in mobile communications. That the success of global adoption of 4G now is happening on 5G based on a global standard. That there is could be risk if there is a fragmentation when it comes to the global standards. We see that that there is a belief that sort of if you call it sort of Western countries could develop their own standard, which will be absolutely subcritical. It will not be globally competitive. So I think the track of decoupling, pulling it to the extreme, is extremely dangerous for the world, and must be fought. But there's a temptation to think that that the Western world can build its own system, etc., and that will definitely stifle innovation. And if you think that we are in a sort of a geopolitical battle there, I mean, then what are those countries seen as the Western world will actually turn out to be the losers.
Thank you. Given the need for more knowledge and more awareness, and also more data and more analysis, you all three, Ulf, Per-Arne, and Joakim, have been in working with these issues for a long time, and also within the ministry. What is your feeling in terms of the needs in order to be updated and be informed within the ministry, but also how do you connect to the other parts of the government, which actually also then deal with policies that could have an impact on the trade? That's Per-Arne, please.
Well, I think the need for facts, for evidence, is really crucial. I think that's something that we constantly push for in the EU internal context when new policy proposals are put forward. Not least when it comes to all these autonomous instruments that some member states want to push forward. We ask for what is the evidence for the need of this? What are the facts? How does the trade, when we talk about resilience, how dependent are we on trade? Is that a bad thing? And what are the, so this is something that we constantly need. So I think the work that Simon and others are doing is really important. But then to get these facts to be discussed is another thing, because what we see now, of course, is that the support for globalization and for free trade is not that. I mean, it didn't start with the Trump administration, but of course the whole context changed. And you have our discussion now. I fully agree with you, Joakim, on the issue of the discussions on industrial policy in Europe. We have a fight, internal fight inside Europe now on the balance, where to strike. We want, as you say, we want a smart, progressive, and an open industrial policy and an open trade policy. Some member states obviously do not seem to be caring so much for that, and they want to have big European projects. and it's a lot about emotions instead of facts. And as you pointed out, Simon, I fully agree. It would be extremely important to know who will, what position the German new government will take on these issues, to see where we can find a balance. Because we've seen now the last 2 years the absence of UK inside EU has changed the balance, and not in our position. We have tried as Sweden to step up to lead the D9 group, and also when it comes to the free trade agenda. I will myself host a dinner on Sunday in Geneva for 14 member states inside the European Union to coordinate our positions ahead of the WTO ministerial meeting. And we have seen, I mean, that with good arguments, you said some of them member states have sort of outsourced their trade policy knowledge to Brussels, and I agree with that. And therefore, some of us member states who have the facts, we have the National Board of Trade, we are really making an effort to spread our views to other member states to get them activated. And as soon as they realize their true interest, they sometimes shift the positions and move into sort of a more free trade oriented direction, which we of course welcome. But it's a tough struggle now, Germany will be key. Look out for what happens in Germany. Who will be the next Minister for Economy, and of course the position of Olaf Scholz on these truly strategic, important issues.
Joakim, you raised your hand.
Yeah, I raised my hand because I want to make this a little bit concrete. Like Per-Arne has probably a very miserable job, if I have to be honest, because everyone working on trade in any government now on the defense playing whack-a-mole against other departments. Because if you really want to seriously understand trade implications of everything that is being invented, with a full bleed over and no clear differentiation anymore, what's domestic policy versus international policy, de facto, it's a very, very significant task. But just to make this very concrete, what I'm missing is not always the conversation. There is a lot of conversation, there are principal discussions, is the understanding of the business impact. And a great example of that is the Schrems II case, right? Schrems II case was fascinating in the radio silence it created in media, right? This is something which is not about the United States, is not about the privacy shield, it's around standard contractual clauses. What is that about? Well, it's about whether corporates can at all transfer any data to a country that is deemed to have security rules, which jeopardizes European data protection. Concrete example, many companies, actually most companies in ERT, we were driver in ERT as Vodafone for this, don't know whether you can outsource to India anymore. And actually, it also has a fascinating effect of all of us becoming, well, we're privatizing foreign policy. I need to pass a judgment on the security regime on Egypt, India, Tanzania. I can tell you, it's not a comfortable situation to be in as a corporate to vocally tell the Egyptian government that I find your country to be a dictatorship. Therefore, I cannot transfer data to you, right? This is not how you want to do neither foreign policy nor economic policy, to be honest. But the way that then the Commission wanted to navigate through this was to delegate to the Data Protection Board. What are these people? Well, that's basically all the member states' data protection agencies. Is anyone related to trade or economic issues even in the room when they're supposed to discuss the implications of this? So it's so fragmented, and therefore Arne's job is basically, would in this case be to chase down the Swedish Data Protection Authority to get them to understand the balance between economic interests of Swedish companies versus the data protection interests, trying to translate into new standard contractual clauses. I mean, it's an unbelievably ungrateful task, but that's exactly what all of us are going to have to do now. So in my view, we have to change the conversation between business and trade departments in all governments, where actually we start educating people around the business impact, because this is properly difficult stuff. It is not easy to understand. A Schrems II case around privacy actually will have an impact on the relationship between a Swedish corporate and the Egyptian government, to the point that you could have a situation where it starts being squeezed out of the market because the Egyptian government gets so angry with the value judgment that Ericsson in this case will need to do visibly to third countries around the globe. There's no discussion around this. It's fascinating.
Yeah.
Ulf, please.
Yeah, first, just to say, I fully agree with Joakim here. And I think that there's this lack of understanding that when we talk digital, when we talk data, when we talk about 5G, when we talk about cybersecurity, this is not sort of a sector issue that is going to need to be handled by one ministry and then trade negotiations to handle that. It impacts, as Joakim highlighted, all sectors. I mean, all industries, all businesses are dependent on data transfers, etc. And there's a lack of understanding. And what we saw in the negotiation for GDPR in Europe was, of course, this was handled by ministries of justice. They hadn't got a clue what the impacts would be in business. And it was even worse that business was not even allowed into the discussion and telling about the consequences of the legislation. So I think, and that's, I mean, coming back to also what's triggered our event and your excellent event this morning, Mia, that we need actually to focus even more on tracking what is happening in the digital field, because it has impacts far outside if there is a sort of a digital sector even. It's so impactful. And it will. We need to focus even more, because if we handle this right, the sort of digitalization of our economies will be extremely beneficial, but could also be seriously mismanaged, as we see. I mean, in the Schrems case, for example, and this, I would say, this is a top priority. We need to solve this across the Atlantic, but where is the attention? Where is the focus? I mean, it's not there.
Could I add a question to you, Simon, on this issue? I mean, you are in your work actually doing analysis whether a policy in one area is actually having a cross-border effect. That must be judgment where you have governments and others who actually disagree with you, or I mean, it must be a very difficult task to do a independent and trustfully something that people trust when it comes to that analysis. Am I right?
Well, I'm sure not everybody is happy with what we find, but let me take the opportunity to say that we, in the area of the traditional trade in goods and in FDI, we use a classic notion of discrimination, which is standard in international trade, and we apply that notion systematically across all of the policy interventions that we use. So our approach has been very much to lay out what the standard is, explain it, describe it, use it consistently, and then let people challenge us if they want to. I think having listened to both Ulf and to Joakim here, when it comes to the digital space, I think we've got to think even more creatively about how we demonstrate potential impact. Now, the classic way that analysts have done this in traditional trade policies, looking at trade flows and all the rest of it. But maybe what is more compelling actually in the digital space will be a series of very well-prepared case studies which highlight the types of dilemmas which are brought up, and also highlight not just the business impact, but also the consequences of failure to speak to business when you're designing these rules as well. So I think we might have to, evolve our evidence base in order to align with the digital economy, and my colleagues and I will certainly be giving that thought.
So thank you. I would just make a last round with all of you. If you wished for something right now in here in terms of promoting more understanding and more knowledge about these issues we have discussed today, what would you see would be the most useful action given from your perspective? I mean, maybe that's a very tough question, but
no, I can start. If you allow me, I will do a complete left field. It was shocking for me to go from government, 20 years in government, and come into a corporate executive committee where we do capital allocation, and realize that everything I've done until that point, I have no clue how the hell they calculate return on capital. I wish everyone in government had to do like 4 weeks in private sector understanding the concept of return on capital. That would imply a completely different mindset of understanding implications of policymaking. But corporates are not doing budget allocation. We're doing investment casing. And it's fascinating, the enormous gap in understanding. And once you clock that, you start understanding what it implies to run a business and what are the business impacts of policy decisions. In the EU case, in particularly my industry, we're now, thanks to private equity trying to take over Telecom Italia, for the first time getting discussions around the fact that Europe and Europe alone has no return on capital in the telecom/digital space. And that has been the case for the last 10 years, but no one has cared. It's irrelevant. You know, that's not something people want to talk about. So I think that I wish everyone had to do training in the corporate world around investment decision and capital allocation.
Great exchange between different sectors of society. Ulf, what is your wish?
Well, I can sort of following on from what Joakim said, of course, being a global company, but having our sort of home base in Europe, being a European company, doing 2/3 of our research and development here, and seeing the tragedy of Europe constantly, and not only Europe constantly falling behind other regions. One reason being the lack of return of capital in the sector where Joakim's company is involved, and not understanding the consequences of that for European competitiveness and European welfare. I mean, to remain welfare states here in this part of the world. And of course, it impacts us, the lack of investments in 5G, for example. So I think that there's a fundamental lack of understanding among policymakers, the importance of creating a strong economy in Europe based on digitalization, which enables innovation. And so to get a better understanding of that and the gap that we need to fill soon would be excellent.
Per-Arne, the last word.
I don't know if it pleases Joakim to know that before I joined the government, I actually spent 2 years in the private sector, so I know how to calculate return on. But I do think that it's difficult to get all government representatives out in the private sector. What we need is a dialogue with the private sector, and we need that constantly and much better. And I can assure you that ahead of the D9 meetings that we organize, we always meet with business sector to get their input into the meeting room and to know what we're doing. But of course, we need more of that. And I think also you as a private sector, you need to speak up, I mean, on the digital issues and on the technical ones, which is difficult sometimes to see the implications for trade and for our economy. And I mean, it's soon Christmas. I have a Christmas wish, and that would be to have a competitiveness strategy for the EU, looking not internally, which is the most competitive inside EU, but looking what's happening in Asia to compare with. I mean, that will be something that we have soon a presidency and soon hopefully a prime minister. So I'll see if I can have some influence in that respect. Thank you.
Thank you, Per-Arne. And Simon, I just want to add, I mean, I think, you know, more dialogue between business and policymakers, but also based on facts, which means we need people like Simon and your colleagues. Your last wish before we end.
So can I take the wishes of everyone else's and add just one more, which is that I wish that the middle powers of the trading system actively get together and do all the things that have just been described. Because I really think it is for the Swedens, the Switzerlands, the UK when it wakes up, Australia, New Zealand, and other, you know, I could think of Korea, Chile, countries like this. We really need to get together and to make this happen and to increase not just the business government dialogue, which is super important, but also to ensure that those deliberations are being fed with high quality data and policy intelligence. So that would be my wish since it's coming up to Christmas.
Thank you very much, all of you, Simon, Per-Arne, Ulf, and Joakim. And it's been it's very interesting. And I think also it shows how important it is to have these type of conversations. And also good luck next week at the WTO ministerial. And thank you so much for sharing your views and your knowledge. And to the audience, goodbye. And I hope to see you soon at SNS. We will continue to follow these issues. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Bye.